All right. Hi, everybody. As Lauren was saying, I am Meg Garey, Executive Director of A Better Chance for Our Children. And if you're not familiar, we provide foster care, adoption, and post-adoption services throughout the state. So we have an office in Wilmington and an office in Milford. And we've been taking some time to provide training and reach out and see what folks are interested in. And so I'm really happy to have our adoption A to Z discussion today. I'm going to go through a lot of logistics. I'm going to try and cover the process the best I can and talk about some of the feelings that come up for our families and kids and some supports that are available, and hopefully it will be beneficial to all. So let me pull up our PowerPoint so we can get started. And as Lauren said, there will be opportunities for questions. And I'll make sure you're aware of those as we go through. So feel free to stop me. Feel free to use the chat box. Feel free to unmute when we have those opportunities. So again, we're talking about adoption A to Z. We're talking specifically about the processes here in Delaware for children who are in foster care. We're going to talk about what that looks like. And there are some different pieces to it. The things I'm hoping to cover today will include the process for parents, some of the processes in terms of what it looks like with termination of parental rights and such. Also, sort of talking to kids about adoption. We're going to talk today about some of the big feelings that come up, and then what does it look like after adoption. So that's my goal. Feel free, as I said, to ask questions as we go along. So the lovely answer that everyone always likes is, when you ask what will it look like, the answer is it depends. So we're going to talk through some of the different factors and what makes a difference. So before we sort of get into some of those specifics, I wanted to just cover the basics. I think many of you are probably aware that, when children are experiencing foster care, the initial goal is reunification with parents, reunification with birth family members, and when those things aren't possible, there's a termination of parental rights for those birth parents, either voluntary or involuntary, and it's at that point that a child becomes legally free for adoption. And when they're legally free for adoption, it means we have to identify a family. And sometimes that involves recruitment. So that means that there's a person in charge of helping find an adoptive family for that child. And then there are times when the family that is currently caring for that child would like to be considered as an adoptive resource. And so we're going to talk through some of those different scenarios today. Part of the process includes family training, so parent training that they have to go through, and family assessments. And then there's also the permanency planning committee, that's part of the selection process. And then there's the adoption finalization. So I'm going to talk through each of these things in more detail. I'm going to be throwing out a lot of information. What I think will be easiest is if you have questions, I am going to pause, but if you have questions as we go along, please either write them down so you don't forget or put them in the chat box. And then when I stop, I'll read through the chat box and answer any questions that I hadn't already covered. And then I'll also open it up if you have more questions. So I'm going to go through a lot. So again, please feel free to mark your questions, and I will do my best to get to everything. Okay. So let's start with one of the initial details. The parents, right? There are different categories of potential adoptive parents. So one category we refer to as traditional adoptive parents. And that just means that those are parents who have come to an agency with the purpose of wanting to adopt. It's not the foster parents who are planning to adopt, it's folks who come with the purpose of wanting to adopt. So they go through training, they have a family assessment, they are approved as potential pre-adoptive resources, and then they have somebody who's in charge of recruiting for them. So someone who is putting together information, sharing information about who they are as a family and who we think they'd be a good fit for, and then that information gets shared, and then folks who are recruiting for kids, looking for families for kids, they can review that information and reach out if they feel like that family might be a good fit for their child. Also, the worker for the family is looking at all the flyers for kids and saying, oh, you know, they might really be a good fit for so-and-so, and maybe we're reaching out to that worker. So it goes both ways. So that's what sort of is the traditional adoptive parent category. We also have foster parents with a private agency licensed for adoption. So a private agency is one that is obviously not the state, but contracts with the state. So like we are a private agency. So there are agencies that do this work who are also licensed for adoption like us. So we have foster parents and we have traditional parents, and we are licensed to provide adoption services. So we also have foster parents with private agencies who are not licensed for adoption. So there are some agencies in the state that provide foster care services and have foster parents, but they do not also provide adoption services. And those families have to be referred to an adoption agency if they would like to adopt. So that means if a family is with one of those agencies, they may be referred to A Better Chance for Our Children or one of the other adoption agencies in the state to finish that part of the process. And again, I'm going to talk through a little bit of what that looks like. The other category is foster parents with the state. So foster parents who are with DFS. If they want to adopt, again, the state is not an adoption agency, and so those families have to be referred to another agency, and in Delaware, those families are all referred to A Better Chance for Our Children. That is a service that we provide to the state, and so we have that contract to provide that service. So if they are foster parents with DFS, they are referred to A Better Chance for Our Children. If they are foster parents with another adoption or another foster care agency that doesn't provide adoption, they can be referred to any of the adoption agencies. Let me go through one more category, and then I will pause and see if there are any quick questions. So the other sort of category here is relatives who maybe are not already approved as foster parents, which does happen, right? Maybe some of you have worked with kids where you've seen that, where they're living with grandma or aunt or uncle, and then they go through the process to be approved as foster parents. And so then they would be foster parents with one of these agencies and follow that path. But if they are relatives who have not already been approved, they'll be referred to one of the adoption agencies to complete that process. So those are the sort of broad categories of potential adoptive parents. So what I want to do is then talk about sort of the next steps. So as I said, please type questions in the chat box, write them down to make sure that I cover everything that you are hoping to learn. So I'm going to go through training, and then I'm going to go through the steps after that. So potential adoptive parents have to complete specific training that is required by the Office of Child Care Licensing, which is OCCL. So that's the group that monitors the foster and adoption agencies. If this is their first time adopting, or if it's been a while, training is their first step. And what it looks like, as I said, will depend on the type of parent. So let's say a family comes to A Better Chance for Our Children wanting to adopt. They come through, training is their first step. So they participate in training, and then they get all of their paperwork, they complete their home assessment, and they are approved for adoption. That way, if there is then a child identified for them, they have already achieved those steps. They don't have to do training again. We don't need a new assessment for them. They are ready to go. We will have updated it as needed as we go along. But again, for let's say the foster parents who are with an agency that does not also provide adoption services, so one of those private agencies that just does foster care or DFS foster parents, they have to go to one of the other agencies and they have to be given training. Even if they've already been trained as foster parents, they have to receive additional training for adoption. And they also have to have an additional assessment that's specific to adoption, even if they're already approved as foster parents. So step one is training. Okay, let's get into even more detail. I know it's a lot of information, so hang with me as we get through these slides, and then I'm going to stop for questions. Okay, so referrals are made for caregivers who are not already approved for adoption. That's what I was just explaining. For those who refer to a better chance for our children, which again is the DFS foster parents or could be foster parents with private agencies who can go to any of the adoption agencies. We hold our classes 4 times a year. Right now we are doing them via Zoom. We just finished our spring session on Saturday, actually. And I've listed here sort of generally when we hold the classes just so that you can have a sense, but we have 4 rounds a year. And they run a sort of 6-week span because we have 2 weeks in between each of the 4 classes that they need to take. There is a note here that if parents miss a class in a round, let's say there's an illness or there was already a scheduling conflict, they have to complete that class before they can have final approval. However, we are happy to proceed with the rest of the process and so that we can get everything else done so that when they finish classes, they can be approved and ready to move on. All right. Okay, so next step, right? So they finish training and then they have their assessment process, which is also the home study process. It is required for adoption, even if they are already approved as foster parents. I know I said that before, but I want to say it again because I know it's something that even foster parents get a little confused by. They're like, well, I've already done this. I've already been trained. I've already had a home study. Yes, indeed. And accept that that was all for foster care. And now we have to do this specific to adoption. When families work with us, they get their paperwork, those big packets at the 3rd class. So of 3 of 4 classes, they get their paperwork at the 3rd class, but we can provide it sooner if there's a deadline such as a court date. We are required to conduct 3 visits with a family before approval, and so that is part of the process. Right now, again, those things are happening mostly via Zoom, but we are required to be in the home at least once. So we are coordinating that to the best of our ability given the current parameters. And again, I think this is really important, so I want to just slow down a little bit. This is an assessment process. So there is not a guarantee that we will approve and or recommend a family, even if they are the current foster family parent caring for a child, or even if they are the current relative caring for a child. It's an assessment process, and it is our job to look at their ability to meet the immediate needs of that child and the long-term needs of that child or children if it's a sibling group. And so we take that very seriously, and we have an in-depth process for a reason, because we really want to make sure that we are gathering as much information as possible, providing as much information as possible, and making sure that it truly is the best choice. So although it is rare, there are times where we as an agency do not feel comfortable recommending either approval or recommending that they be selected as the resource. And when that happens, it can go a number of different ways, but we really want to be clear with parents and with those involved that it is not a foregone conclusion. And so wanting folks to just know that going in is really important. Okay, a couple other things around the assessment. So the assessment is completed for a specific child or children if it's a sibling group identified for adoption. A family must have a new assessment, not an update or an addendum if they're referred in the future for another adoption. So that's true of foster families. These are child specific. It's not true for the traditional families as I was speaking about, but for the foster families who are then referred for adoption, those adoption home studies, those assessments are specific to the child or children that are identified at that time. So let's say, Mary and Joe adopt, little Johnny this year, and then 3 years later they're referred again. They need a new home study specific to that child. And so just keeping that in mind. The assessment itself, when it is completed, is valid for 1 year. If for some reason, they had been referred before there was TPR, and then TPR is delayed, and we get to that year mark and it hasn't been finalized, then we have to update the home study because it will no longer be valid. So just wanting to make sure that folks understand some of those details. Okay, I'm going to go through a couple more things and then I'm going to pause for questions. So if you've put questions in the chat box, I'm going to get to them shortly. And then I'll also, if you want to unmute and ask a question, feel free. So timeframes. So when we're talking about the foster families or relatives who are referred to us, the entire process typically takes 4 to 6 months from when they start classes. As I said before, the classes are generally 6 weeks start to finish. And the approval may be delayed if they miss a class and have to make it up the next round. The assessment or the home study takes 2 to 3 months, and it generally starts after the parents finish classes, but can start earlier if needed. And part of this also depends on how quickly the parents are able to work through the paperwork and complete the tasks that are required. Those are pieces that we as an agency can encourage, but we don't actually control. So those are different factors in terms of how long it may take. And so we want folks to know that, you know, if you're a part of, you know, scheduling an adoption hearing or part of those conversations, you want to be thoughtful about where the family might be in the process. If they haven't even been referred to a Better Chance for Our Children yet, let's say it's a DFS foster parent and you know they're going to come to ABC because that's that path. Then you want to think about, all right, have they adopted before? If they adopted before, then maybe they don't need to take classes again, so maybe it won't take very long. If they've never adopted before and they haven't been referred yet, then depending on where we are in our cycle of classes, we may be looking at 6 to 9 months out before they can be approved. And so just needing to, this is why I'm so glad to be able to have this time to sort of explain the process so that if you're part of those conversations, it might look like. Okay, so if the foster family has adopted and come through ABC before, then we will need to, as I said, complete a new home study for the child or children specific to this request. If it has been 3 years or less since the parents came through, then they don't need to take classes again, so that cuts down on the time frame. If it has been more than 3 years, then they may be required to take some or all of the classes again. It's decided on a case-by-case basis with the DFS worker to determine what makes the most sense for that family. Okay, so now I'm going to pause as promised for questions. So let me just pull up the chat box real quick. Oh, that's not what I wanted. Give me one moment. I'm going to pull up the chat box and try and answer some questions. Yes, I will talk about the difference between permanent guardianship and adoption. And thank you, because it was on my notes and I missed it. And then how long is the training? So I will cover those. So I have those 2 questions that I'm going to answer. Difference between adoption and permanent guardianship. Thank you again for asking that. And then how long is the training? So I'm going to talk about that. If you have other questions, again, feel free to put them in the chat box, or I'll pause so that folks can unmute and ask. So adoption and permanent guardianship, one of the primary differences is that for permanent guardianship, there is not the termination of parental rights. So there's no TPR. For adoption, there must be TPR. It terminates those parents' legal rights, and then they move to the adoptive parents. Those adoptive parents now have the legal rights. When there's termination of parental rights and the child is still in foster care, the state then holds those rights. For permanent guardianship, the parental rights stay with the parents. And there's no TPR in that situation. Those parents are still legal parents. They are the permanent guardians, but the parental rights stay with the birth parents. It is not an easy thing to undo. So it is similar in terms of permanency to adoption, but it is not the same. And then there are some sort of legal differences when it comes to inheritance and those pieces when it's permanent guardianship versus adoption, because those are legally different. But that is the primary difference. So we don't see permanent guardianship happening as much for our younger kids, because what we want is to really achieve that true legal permanency. But we do often see it for our older kids, and sometimes it makes a lot of sense. And sometimes we see it also more with relatives, where they want to maintain who they are as a relative, and they don't want to be a part of sort of terminating those parental rights, but they do want to provide permanency. And then also for our older youth, there are times when they don't want that legal they don't want to be severed, that legal tie to be severed to their family. They don't want to change their last name. They don't want those things to happen, but they're okay with permanent guardianship. Because that's the other difference for adoption and permanent guardianship, is that with adoption, there can be a name change. With permanent guardianship, there's not. I mean, they could go and do it, you know, just at a courthouse, as anybody could, as I could, but it doesn't happen the same way. So for those who asked that question, if you have more, if I didn't cover what you were asking, please feel free to unmute and ask a follow-up. So in terms of how long is the training, so for a better chance for our children, the training happens again on 4 Saturdays. It's 28 total hours, and again it takes 6 weeks because we have 2 weeks in between each training, which is very intentional on our part because we go through a lot of information and we include a lot of reading, and we want folks to have time to get through that. And I think, as I was saying before, we take this process very seriously, and so we want it to be reflective for the parents. We want them to really be thinking about the information they're receiving and thinking about this commitment that they're planning to make, and so we want them to have time in between to do that. Okay, so those were the 2 questions that had popped up in the chat box. I'll keep an eye on it to see if more pop up, but does anybody want to unmute and ask a question?
Can I, how firm is the 1 year after, like, let's say a family had the home assessment and and TPR, but because it got dragged out in the court system, you know, like it looks like the court date for the final adoption will maybe be a month after the year after they had the home study, just because of court dates and stuff. Is that a absolute number?
It is. It is, and it's because of licensing. It's not an agency decision, it's a licensing requirement. However, it's just an update that has to be completed, and so it is something that can be done relatively easily and quickly. And so as long as we are we know what's happening, and usually we know, right? We're like, oh, this hasn't finalized. Then we can get it done before that time so that it is ready for whenever that hearing happens.
Gotcha.
Yep. Other questions? Okay. So I thought there was a monetary component with permanent guardianship. So yes, so with permanent guardianship and adoption, there are both options for subsidies, but what that looks like depends on what the child is sort of eligible for, and with permanent guardianship, it is an option that there is an ongoing subsidy. Other questions about what I've covered so far? Okay, there will be other opportunities, and again, continue to use your chat box. I appreciate that. It has worked very well. And so I'm gonna keep going with a couple more details in terms of the process, and then I'll pause again and we can see what else has maybe come up. So let me get us back to our PowerPoint. Okay. Okay, so we paused for questions. We're gonna give that a second to refresh. All right, so as I mentioned in the beginning, right, so we start with training, and then we have the family assessment / home study, and then we have the selection process. So prospective adoptive families are presented to the Permanency Planning Committee, which is PPC. Okay, so if we were talking about a child who somebody was recruiting for, and or there's a child who is with a foster family who would like to be considered as a permanency resource, but let's say a relative is also interested. Multiple families may be presented for a child, and it is the PPC who decides who that resource will be. So each family has a worker who will go and sit in front of the Permanency Planning Committee, present their family, provide them with a report, talk about what the family strengths are and why they think they're a good long-term fit for this child. And then it's the Permanency Planning Committee that ultimately decides who that resource will be. And so, again, even current caregivers have to be presented to PPC for selection. So let's say, again, you know, little Mark has been with his foster family. They want to be the adoptive resource. Everybody thinks that's a great idea. They go through the process. They are presented to PPC. PPC, again, they still have to be presented to PPC, even if they are the only family being considered, because we need that committee to take a look and see if they agree that, yes, Mark, little Mark's family is the best long-term resource for him and to meet his needs. So we will, again, so every family gets presented to PPC, and when it's multiple families, they make that ultimate decision. All right, so after selection, actually, let me go back real quick, because there are a couple of things in between. So the selection process. So if it is let's say it's a child who there's been the termination of parental rights, there is recruitment happening, a few traditional families have been presented, the family selected. It's at that point that that child would transition into living with that family, and a child has to be with a family for a minimum of 6 months before an adoption can finalize. So for the kids who aren't being adopted by their current caregivers, they will transition into life with that family, usually over a period of time. It's going to vary depending on the situation and the child and other factors, but over a period of time, they will transition. And then they need to be with that family for 6 months before an adoption can finalize. So I just wanted to make sure that I was clear on that. Okay, so adoption finalization. Yay! So a couple of these specifics just around, we're just doing logistics right now, right? Okay, so it is a deputy attorney general that is assigned to the case is the person who drafts the adoption petition. And so they draft the petition, the DFS worker has the parent sign and notarize, and then they file the petition. Generally speaking, this is how it works. There's no need for the parents. The child is represented. The parents are responsible for filing the petition fee. They're responsible for paying a petition filing fee, but there are no additional costs to the family at this time. And then the adoption finalization makes the adoptive parents the child's legal parents. It's the same thing if it was permanent guardianship. There also has to be a petition filed. They're also responsible for the fee, and then that permanent guardianship finalization makes them legal parents again, but the birth parents maintain their parental rights. So I'm gonna pause again for questions. I think I saw one maybe in the chat box. Okay, do foster parents who have been with DFS need to have a home study other than what they had for fostering? Yes. So foster parents who are foster parents for DFS or who are foster parents with one of the private agencies who do not provide adoption services. So there's sort of two groups of agencies here. You have private agencies who provide adoption services and private agencies that don't and just provide foster care. And then you have the DFS foster parents. So for foster parents who are with the private agencies that don't provide adoption services and foster parents who are foster parents for DFS, they all have to be referred to an adoption agency, and that adoption agency has to provide training and provide a home study, even though they've already had training for foster care and had a home study for foster care. They have to have training and a home study specific to adoption. So the answer is yes, they have to have a new assessment and new training. And yes, the foster parents are thrilled about that. I mean, sometimes they actually really do appreciate the training. They feel like they get a lot out of it. So, but yes, it can feel like a lot when they've already completed, these processes. Okay, other questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
Are CASAs allowed to attend the permanency hearing or meeting?
The permanency
planning committee?
I
meeting.
Believe yes, but I feel like maybe I should let somebody else answer that in case I am wrong. But I do believe CASAs can be included in that.
Yes, Meg, this is Sam Clancy. They are absolutely encouraged to attend.
Thank you, Sam.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
For some reason, I just wanted to make sure that I didn't get that wrong.
Yeah, you're good.
Thanks.
Okay, so hold on. I see a hand raised and I see some questions. Meant adoption classes. Are trainings being given? Sorry, yes. So I'm going to answer a couple of questions in the chat box and then I will come to Lois. I see you raise your hand and have a question. So yes, the foster parents have to complete our trainings. Yes. So I can speak for a better chance for our children. We are still providing our training classes. We just finished our spring round on Saturday and are starting our summer round in June. I know some of the other agencies have also started some of their classes via Zoom or on some online platform. I can't speak to every one of them specifically, but I do know that I believe most of them are, and I know that we are. And then Lois, let me find you, or feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. Yes. What is your question?
My question is in regards to if perchance that a parent is made aware or know that they have a terminal illness and or even in light of COVID and a parent dies, but the parent had made specific instructions as to who they wish to have as their guardian for their child or children. Is the court process necessary as far as the adoption agency and going through those steps if it's specifically determined who the parent wished to now be the new guardian, either in the event of their death or now that they passed away suddenly, but they had it in writing? Have you had any experience with that?
So you're talking about a birth parent who had made a plan like in their will, not a child who's in foster care, correct? Sorry.
Yes.
Okay. So that is less.
Yes, because those things can be specified in the will. Yes.
Sure. And so again, that's less our area of expertise, so I'd be happy to have anyone else sort of chime in. But I believe that it is in their will. It does not have to go through the same family court process that it would, let's say, where it was a second parent adoption or something like that. But if anybody has different information, please share. I like to be very clear that I'm not a legal authority, and I say that to parents a lot.
This is Lauren. Lois, that was a great question, and I don't know the answer either. So I'd be happy to ask one of the child attorneys what happens exactly. So let me find out.
Yeah, what I can say is that we are involved when there are cases, again, of like second parent adoption or relative adoption for children who are not in foster care. And this is not something that I've come across or been asked to do or that we provide. So that's why I'm assuming that it is not required, but it's always, again, always good to double check. So I'm going to answer a couple more questions in the chat box. So for a better chance for our children, our classes starting in June will be online. We are planning our summer round to take place via Zoom again because we, don't know what will be allowed per state orders, and we recognize that individuals may not be comfortable being in, a contained space with strangers for a while. And so what we're doing is planning that it will be online. So let's see. Any other questions before? Okay, so this sort of ends my discussion on like the process. The next part is going to be talking to kids about adoption, and then feelings, and then sort of what things look like after the adoption. So if you have other sort of process questions that pop up, again, please use the chat box, and I will take a look and answer those as I can. We are going to take a break partway through, so feel free to use that time if you want to ask more questions, and I'd be happy to answer. All right, so it looks like we're okay to keep going. So let me move us on to our next section. There we go. Talking to kids about adoption, right? So we have kids that get adopted at all ages through many different circumstances. And so we just want to talk about some general things to keep in mind when we talk about talking to kids about adoption. I always like to use a little humor, and I like this one very much. So at what age do you tell a highway it's adopted? So when you're asking this question about kids, the answer is always. Always. We should always be talking to our kids about adoption. And when they're very little, we want to be using storybooks. We want to make sure that we have the pieces present, right? We have a picture of the adoption finalization. I know right now a lot of things are happening online, but something to commemorate that event. If appropriate and possible, you have pictures of birth family around. Like, the answer is always. We should always be talking about adoption when that is a part of the reality. I don't mean we should always be talking about adoption when children are in foster care, because reunification is the goal. Okay, so it's not always easy to explain adoption, especially to younger kids. So a couple of things. Be as clear and as direct as possible. Utilize books about adoption, and utilize the My Life program if that's something that the child has been a part of, because it is meant to help prepare children for adoption and to provide a life book that can be an ongoing tool for both a child and a parent for, information and photos and, telling their story. Older kids will have more questions and more feelings at the time, and those things will happen later for our younger kids. So we want to be as open as possible and create a safe space for them to ask questions and share feelings. And when I say we need to be open and direct, I mean we need to be open and direct, and they shift as a child gets older. So there may be information that we share when a child is younger, but we share it in a different way with perhaps more details as that child ages. But they should always have the information, because kids need to know their story. It's really important that we don't make it seem as if their story or the fact that they were in foster care or the fact that they're adopted is something that they should be ashamed of, because it's not. It's not. And so we need to make sure that we are creating really good space for them within that. So let's just talk through a little bit of what this looks like as kids age. So, when kids are younger, 3 to 7, they're learning words. They should learn about the word adoption, and they should be told their story, and they should understand it. But we have to recognize that they're not going to really understand the true meaning of all of it in that time. Because they're, ages 3 to 7, they're just making sense of the world, let alone these complicated issues. And this is why it needs to be an ongoing conversation. I remember talking to an adoptive parent once who was telling me that, yeah, they always did this. They talked about it. She knew she had a tummy mommy. She knew her name. There was a picture. And yet this child, who at this time was probably about 5, was like, no, but when did you give birth to me? And she's like, no, honey, it wasn't me. It was, it was your tummy mommy. It was so-and-so. She's like, no, I know, but when was I in your tummy, right? Like, she was 5. She didn't really understand it. She knew all the words, but she didn't really understand what it all meant. So we have to keep having these conversations. And remember that, when kids are young, like our toddlers and our preschoolers, they're sort of okay with whatever their parents say and think is okay, right? So they're going to go along with it and think adoption is great if you say it's great. But that, in that may shift, right? When they're little, they may be proud that they are adopted and they think it's cool because you think it's cool and they're cool with everybody knowing. And then they get older and they no longer think it's so cool and they don't want everybody to know. And so those things just may shift, and we need to make sure that parents sort of remember that it's going to depend on where they're at. And, you know, maybe it doesn't change, but for some kids it will. They may, as you know, as we can see here from ages sort of 7 to 9, as they start to begin to understand some of those differences between adoption and birth, that they might start to show some insecurity. That when they recognize sort of what their story is, they may start to wonder, wait, if there were other people and they weren't taking care of me, but you decided to take care of me, does that mean you're going to always take care of me or not? Because they were supposed to take care of me, but they didn't. So could that happen again? You know, like it can just start to sort of, those questions can start to bubble. So we need to recognize that as they grow, there may be different issues and different questions, and they may be at different points when they're at different ages when they're being adopted. So from ages, you know, sort of 9 to 12, this is the point where they might start, you know, sort of fantasizing about birth family, and stop thinking adoption is so cool and might have more questions, and they may start to, you know, sort of push away and be confused and have some negative behaviors in this time. And so we have to be careful, again, and be intentional about making sure that there's space for these questions, space for these concerns. You know, we know ages 12 to 16 are a harder time of life in general. It's that identity phase of development. It is pressure for our kids in general. And if we think about children who are perhaps trying to achieve permanency during this time, it is really tricky, because developmentally what I'm supposed to be doing is moving away and having some independence. But if I'm trying to develop permanency, you're trying to pull me in as my adoptive parents and my attachment figures. So it's this odd sort of push and pull that's happening developmentally, unconscious to everyone, where for our older kids trying to achieve permanency at that age, it can just be more complicated. It's complicated all along, let's be clear. As Mary Lou, who founded our agency, likes to say, younger doesn't mean easier, it just means longer. So there are different complications that are going to come up. We just want to be aware of what some of the dynamics are. So for our kids, again, the sort of 12 to 16, that identity phase of development, they, you know, and who they're going to be, and this is the time at which they might want to start, you know, searching for birth family, and you know, in this day and age, they can, right, pretty easily. They can, if they have some names and they have some information, they can start looking, and so it's better for our kids to be able to do that with their parents as opposed to on their own. So that's why, again, it's important that our parents, and we're encouraging our parents to be open, to be having these discussions, because these thoughts and questions are going to happen with or without parents, and we want to make sure it's with parents. And another reason why it's very important that we are always speaking of birth families with empathy, that we need our kids to recognize that we have empathy for who their birth families are and what they've experienced, because they were doing the best that they could, and they brought this child into the world, and that's good. And so a child's going to be more willing to ask questions, to maybe search with their adoptive parents if they know that their birth parents, if their birth parents are being viewed with some love and some empathy. So as a child sort of is 16 and up and moving into adulthood, it is a time when they often sort of pull some of these pieces together, and they maybe have integrated their story and made sense of things. But we also have to remember that there's some things that are going to flare up. There may be, again, these sort of important milestones that come up that can be really hard. So graduations, weddings, divorces, children being born, losses, all of those things can come up related to their adoption story. And so it is a lifelong piece of who they are and a lifelong part of their story. And so it's important that we all keep that in mind, that we make sure our kids know that it's always going to be a part of who they are, and that our parents know it's always going to be a piece of their relationship. So, all right. So some common questions that parents might get from kids. And then we'll just talk about, again, some strategies around there. So if you're talking to parents and you want to offer some support. So they may ask things, right, like, why didn't I grow in your tummy? Again, for our kids who came to families younger, why don't I look like you? And then these are questions that can come at sort of any age, if they don't have this information. What does my birth mother look like? What does my birth father look like? Again, talking about that My Life service again and getting them those life books can be really important if we, because then there's a worker whose job it is to try and find as much information as possible and pull it all together for them. And I think that has a lot of value. And so they spend a lot of time on Facebook or other things trying to find pictures. Or sometimes where they find them is, it's arrest photos. But if that's what we have, that's what we have. And it's better for a child to know and have a picture than to have nothing. One of the other sort of important questions, why couldn't my parents take care of me? Again, in those life books, we want to be putting language in about what those struggles were and why their parents couldn't do it, and that it's not about their love for their child, it's about their capacity to parent, and trying to be specific about, they really struggled with mental health issues and couldn't keep you safe. They really struggled with substance abuse and weren't able to keep themselves safe. There are different pieces, but we need to give that information to our kids. And then the question that, often comes up is, why did you adopt me? And for some of our parents, that's it's not always the easiest thing to answer, but it's important that they have an answer. Like, why did you adopt me? Why did you want me? You chose me. I didn't choose anybody. You chose me. Why? Because how you answer that question, or how parents answer that question, is going to make a difference. So it's important that our parents have thought about that. Okay, a couple more things. So some general strategies. Remember, kids are curious and observant. As I was saying before, the way we talk about their story will have a big impact on how they view it. We need to be open and matter of fact. Again, we need to speak of their birth family with empathy. So this is another piece, like, their attention spans are short, so they don't need like a whole talk. We really do want to answer their questions in the simplest way possible. We want to answer it, and then we want to stop talking. As I've said in other spaces, we are often driven by our own discomfort or pain for the child, and so we over talk out of our own anxiety. And what we need to do is be very clear on what a child is asking, and then answer that, and then stop talking. And I say be very clear on what they're asking, because sometimes they're asking something that you're sort of projecting onto. So you give this whole convoluted answer about something, and they're actually just asking something very simple. So be clear about what they're asking, give them a simple, clear answer, and then stop talking. And then see what else, may come. Okay, some other strategies. Talk, right? Put it out there. I wonder if, I've been thinking about, and these are things that may be, again, these are maybe suggestions you're giving to parents, not necessarily having the space for yourselves with kids, but maybe you do have those spaces. And so, again, the more you sort of show that it's okay to talk about, the more our kids will feel comfortable opening up. So talk. Again, I wonder if, it was just Mother's Day. I wonder if you think about your mom on Mother's Day. I think about her. I've been thinking about how hard it must be, for your birth mother on your birthday. I bet she really misses you today. I wonder if you think about her. Give space when needed. Again, the idea is to put it out there so that a kid knows that it's okay to talk about it, it's okay to have questions, but we shouldn't be the one sort of driving that. We shouldn't be pushing. We should just be putting it out there and then following their lead. Use positive adoption language, which I have some examples of on the next couple of slides, so we're gonna look at that, and that's important. If families can, keep a photo from the adoption finalization in a prominent position, because it helps remind the child that it is something that is important and to be celebrated, and that it is a good part of their story. And if possible, have pictures of birth family around too. You're all an integrated family now as an adoptive family, or they are all integrated. And it's important that that's shown. Again, I'm not saying that that is possible or appropriate in every situation, but when it is, it's important. It helps that child integrate. Families should keep the life book around and accessible if they can. If they need to sort of pull pieces out, that's okay, to be given later or with additional detail. But again, they should always know their story. Okay, so let's talk about some positive adoption language. So there's some ideas here. Again, instead of saying natural parent or real parent, we want to go with biological parent or birth parent. And it's just, if we think about the opposites, so if we're talking about a natural parent, then is the opposite of that an unnatural parent, or a real parent, an unreal parent, a fake parent. So we just want to be thoughtful about language, sort of words matter. And I know I've said this before in other spaces, but trying to use person first language as much as possible. We always want to put the person first. So a child who has been adopted, those kinds of things, right? So own/real versus birth child, real parent versus birth parent. Again, we don't want to say real parent. I don't know why that's on there twice. Again, we really want to talk about an adoption plan, not a child who was given up. And I understand that sometimes it's weird to think about an adoption plan for a parent whose parental rights were terminated involuntarily, but a plan was made for that child. The parents weren't necessarily maybe in a space where they could do it, but a plan was made. A child wasn't given up. That child wasn't abandoned. A parent did the best that they could, and a plan was made. These things matter to our kids. They send messages. Again, child taken away / terminated, we want to be specific about, there was a termination of parental rights. And let's also remember that a termination of parental rights is not a termination of a relationship. It's not a termination of a connection. So we have to always honor those pieces. It's a legal reality. But it doesn't mean that that person is just gone now. No. So here's some other suggestions. Again, we use resource parent usually instead of foster parent. I use foster because it's what folks are most used to, but we use resource parent broadly speaking to refer to all of our parents. They are a resource for the child and for a family. Because the idea is that our foster parents should also be resources to the birth family. The goal is reunification, so if they can be a resource for that birth parent, isn't that ideal? So we don't want to think of them just as foster parents. We want to think of them as resource parents. So we hear this a lot, so-and-so, they've decided to keep little Mark. Well, they decided to parent little Mark, right? We don't want to think of little Mark as a thing that gets kept or not, right? He's a child who gets parented. So it's these kinds of things. Same thing with like up for adoption, which is actually very interesting if anybody has read or learned about like the orphan train. That's where that term comes from, is that because children were literally put up on blocks So that is where the term comes from, to be put up for adoption. And so again, we want to think about a child as a child and not a thing that gets put on a block and then picked. So it's a child in need of an adoptive family. Same reason with placed in a home versus joined a family, because again, they are things, they're not things that get placed. They are children who join families, and that we want to focus on families and not homes, because it's the family, it's the people. They're the ones who are doing the caring for and helping with healing, not a home, not a place. Same thing with removed or taken away. We want to say separated. They were separated from their birth family. It has a different connotation to it, and it's important. You'll see here the sort of the giveaway, give up, put up for adoption. Again, we want to do choose adoption or make an adoption plan. Matched with versus connected. So matched is also one of those that has a historical component to it, that it used to be that literally with adoption, they were looking for matches, right? Looking for parents who looked like a child or a child who looked like parents wanting to adopt, that they were trying to match them so that nobody could tell that they were adopted. And that's just not how this functions anymore. We don't want them to match. We don't need them to match. We want them to be connected. We want them to connect. And so that's the phrase we've come up with. And the last one on this list is adopted versus was adopted. You know, adoption is an event. It's a legal reality. It is something that happened. It is not something that needs to forever define a child. Again, we just wanted to think about those labels and what language means to us. So a child was adopted. All right, so I'm going to run through a list of books that we recommend. It's a small list. I have like a 4-page list. This is just one slide that I'd be happy to send out if that's something folks would be interested in. And then I'm going to pause for questions, and then we're going to take our break. So here are just a few that we like. A family is a family is a family. I like that one very much. I think it speaks to many situations. A Mother for Chaco is very specific about adoption. The Invisible String, if you guys haven't seen that one, is a good broad book that can be used in a lot of situations, but the idea is that even when we're not with a person, we're still connected by an invisible string. We Belong Together, a book about adoption and families. Elsa in the Box of Memories is one that I also like a lot. Riley the Brave may be one that you've come across. It's a local author, and it was a book written specifically for children who have been in foster care, have been adopted, and have experienced some tough challenges early on in life, and about how those sort of emotions have worked for them, and how we can reframe some of those. Little Branch Gets Adopted, and by Sherry Eldridge, and she has a lot of books, and they're all fantastic. Also, 20 Things Adopted Kids Wish Their Adoptive Parents Knew is a good one to suggest to parents, also by Sherry Eldridge. Okay, so I saw one thing in the chat box, so I'm going to pop over to that real quick. It lets me. Give me just a moment. Okay, I'm going to have to stop sharing, which means that everyone's going to be mad because they're writing down book names, but I will send it to you. All right, hold on just a second. Yes, I will send the book list to Lauren, and she can send it to everybody, because I do think that is an important resource. So before we take our break, does anybody have any other questions? Again, feel free to put them in the chat box, and I'll look at them through the break and then can answer them when we come back. All right, so it's about 2:04, so why don't we'll break for 10 minutes and get started again at 2:15.
All right, so I do have an answer to Lois's question. So Lois earlier asked, what happens if two parents pass away and in their will, they designate who is the designee to raise the child? So I did consult one of our child attorneys who said first, just to make sure that if to clarify that both parents pass away, because if it's just one parent passes away, by nature, it reverts to the remaining parent unless there's some reason that parent cannot provide adequate care for the child. But I believe Lois's question is that what happens if both parents are deceased? So the person who is designated as the person to raise the child still needs to petition for adoption or guardianship. So they basically still need to take some form of action. And the petition for adoption would allege that both parents are deceased and it's in the child's best interest for the petition to be granted. They would still need a social report that is required, which can run about $1,500. I'm not quite sure about adoption classes, but it does say the social report still needs to be completed, because I believe that goes along with the adoption petition. And then so sometimes people would just go for guardianship, which would avoid that social study requirement. So they just file for guardianship of the child or children. There's also a process called standby guardianship in Delaware, that if a parent is very ill but hasn't yet passed away, that person can apply, or the person that is going to be designated can apply to become the guardian as well. So long answer short is that if both parents pass away and somebody is designated, that person either needs to file for petition for adoption or guardianship, legal guardianship.
And I will say that it is a slightly different home study process and that classes are not required.
Perfect. Okay. Yeah, Lois.
Thank you very much for the answer. I didn't mean to raise my hand. But
I love the beautiful picture.
I just wanted to say thank you. I was going to take back the hand. Thank you for getting the answer. I appreciate it.
No problem. That was a great question. And my scenario to the attorney who I was asking says, just to make sure that I wanted to be clear, I said, all right, let's take Cinderella, for example. All right, both her parents died. Did the stepmother have to take guardianship?
I like it. All right, so we are going to start back up by talking about big feelings, because when it comes to adoption, getting there, finalizing, all of that can bring some pretty big feelings up. And so we just want to be thoughtful about what that might look like. So maybe just real quick for yourselves, take a second, think about kids you've worked with, families you've worked with, and see what kinds of feelings have you seen come up. I'm sure there were some positive feelings. I'm sure there was some negative feelings. I'm sure there was some combination thereof. So let's think about what kinds of things that come up for parents, for kids, and for family members, because these things don't happen in a vacuum. Sometimes there are folks adopting who already have children in their family. Sometimes those kids have feelings, and sometimes it's extended family members who have feelings about the choices they've made. Sometimes those are really good feelings, and sometimes they aren't. So let's just think a little bit about what some of those feelings may be. So we can run the gamut, right? We have excitement, anxiety, relief, jealousy, fear, impatience. I know that one comes up a lot. Some confusion, some dread maybe. Loyalty and disloyalty issues can come up. Feelings of belonging, and then also feelings of guilt. So all of those can be very complicated, and each person, a child, a parent, a family member, can feel them in different ways. So a child can feel guilty that they are now going to be legally part of another family and not their birth family. They can have feelings of, again, like loyalty to their adoptive family, or loyalty to the birth family, or feeling disloyal for either one or both. And it can be hard to work through a lot of those. And again, I feel like they can have some version of all of these, where we can hold both, of being very excited and afraid. And I think that happens a lot. So what might we see in our kids with all of these feelings? Sometimes we see a decrease in behavior challenges. at home or school. Sometimes we see an increase in behavior challenges at home or school. That decrease can come out of a sense of maybe some relief, right? Like, okay, you know, this is what's going to happen. Now I know what my life is going to be. And then, okay, this is going to happen. Is this what my life is going to be, right? There can be some dread that comes with it too. You can see some defiance and some withdrawal, some tantrums and meltdowns and some regression because there are a lot of big feelings. If we think about our kids, especially our kids who've had some of the more significant developmental trauma or more significant challenges with attachment, they equally really, really, really want that attachment and security and legal permanency, and also fear it. And so it can be a really hard sort of push and pull at that time for everyone involved. So we know that there's always a lot going on underneath our feelings. So let's think about grief, because grief can be one of the feelings that have come up, or that's coming up for a child, feeling like they've lost something, even if they never, quote unquote, had it. So they may be grieving the life they imagined they could have had with their birth family, or they may be grieving a relationship with a sibling that they don't get to be raised with. But there's a lot to grieve, even amidst, again, some excitement and some joy and some relief. There may be some fear, like in the end, you know, you might actually leave me too. They might not trust that their parents are going to stay with them, and they may be testing those boundaries. Again, for those of you who, when you were thinking about kids you've worked with who've seen an increase in behaviors, sometimes it's testing those boundaries. You say you want me. You say you're going to keep me. Really? What if I do this? What if I do this? There's some fear involved. They don't trust it. And maybe not really feeling like they belong, that they feel different. Maybe they feel like they don't look like everyone around the table, or they don't fit in the same way. That they might, again, be excited about this new legal permanency and that this will be their family. But maybe that also comes with, again, there's some loss involved in that, and knowing like, oh, this is going to be my family forever, and I'm not going to be raised with people who share my history or are genetically connected to me, which we know is not the most important thing, but it does matter sometimes to our kids. Sometimes they feel sort of undeserving. Again, our kids can have very sensitive sort of rejection buttons and feeling unlovable because they feel like, you know, the parents that were supposed to love them couldn't. And so they sometimes internalize this feeling of being unlovable. So if I didn't deserve my own, you know, sort of birth mother's love, then how do I, quote unquote, deserve yours? Again, it's that really deeply rooted, not so logical logic that sometimes is in there before we even know it. I've been feeling some pressure. You know, sometimes kids are really sent some of these messages like they should be excited and they should be grateful and they should feel lucky that all of this is happening, but they don't always feel lucky or grateful or excited, or they hold that piece with some other pieces. So you know, it's this big deal and there's going to be a party. I know not every family does, and a lot of families, you know, can sense what their kid needs, but kids can have a lot of mixed feelings around it. So they might be feeling some pressure, and maybe now some pressure to like really fit in or really be the kid they think they're supposed to be. And then again, at some different cognitive and developmental stages, they're going to have some different questions, and the flavor of those questions may change and become more complex as they change and become more complex as little people. And so some of those things can be underneath the feelings that come up around finalization and around adoption. And yes, it can be a really good thing, but it also, as I said, it's complicated. So, right, let's think about the changes that can come. Because often I think I talk to parents who've maybe been caring for a child for a while, and they think, oh, you know, it's not that big of a change. It's not that big of a deal. You know, everything's going to go on as it has been. But that's not necessarily true. If you think about, you know, sort of getting married or any other sort of legal commitment or long-term thing that you're deciding, you can have anxiety around it, even if you know it's the right thing. And you can have different feelings about it. And you can have, you know, thoughts of maybe like, oh, should I, shouldn't I? You know, maybe some regret at some point. Like there are different feelings that come up, and parents' feelings may change. It may be harder than they thought it was, or they may feel like they got pressured into it, or they may feel like they feel like they're not doing the best they can for their child, and their child is struggling. And, you know, on the flip side, parents who are really nervous about it may realize that they could do more than they thought they could, and that it is richer than they knew it would be. You know, there are both sides. Same thing with our children's feelings, and same things with the behaviors, that these things really can shift as we go along. And as I said before, they may shift at different, you know, times of life in those developmental stages. And so, you know, when it comes to helping families through those times or preparing them, you know, as they come up to a finalization, you know, what mostly is needed is time and patience, right? Sending messages of security and commitment, making sure that if we are helping our families engage in therapy, that we're finding resources that have some experience or knowledge, you know, sort of these particular challenges, because it is a particular challenge. Q-tip is one that we share with parents a lot, which is quit taking it personally, because sometimes our kids, again, they're throwing all this stuff at their parents, and it's not necessarily about what their parents are doing or not doing. They're bringing a whole host of previous experiences with them that can sort of color how they're reacting to the parents in front of them now. And so, again, that's why we just need that time and patience and commitment and security messages, and not take it personally. And the other piece is post-adopt services, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about in our next section. So I'm going to talk about some post-adopt services, and then I'm going to open it back up for questions to see what other things that would be helpful to cover that I haven't covered about the process or anything else, and then we will finish up. Okay, after the adoption. All right, what do we want to keep in mind? We want to keep in mind that healing takes time, and that adoption is an incredibly important milestone, but it doesn't have magical healing powers, right? It doesn't automatically heal a child from the trauma or the hurts that they've experienced. So I've got challenges on Tuesday. I'm still going to have those challenges on Thursday just because we got to keep those, or even though I was adopted on Wednesday, right? We have to keep that in mind, that it's still going to take time. And adoption is a beautiful, wonderful thing. And for a lot of our kids, it really does help them feel secure, feel a sense of relief. But it also can bring up some other feelings. And remembering that it takes more than love. Love is really important. It helps keep us committed, and it helps us find delight in things. But we can't imagine that in and of itself is going to bring us through hard times, right? We all know that. We have to take different approaches. We have to take time for ourselves. We have to make sure we're supporting and giving our kids what they need. Because we have to remember that in addition to our, being impacted emotionally by their experiences, our kids' brains have been changed. Those early developmental traumas and chronic stress, it impacts brain development. And so there are some capacities that we're going to have to build for them, and some skills they're going to have to develop, and that's going to take some time. And as an agency, what we've sort of seen and what we believe is that it takes sort of minimum of 3 years to heal from every 1 year of trauma. And what we mean by that is not that they're going to be up here at the height of their challenges for 3 years, but that, you know, they may start up here and then there's going to be sort of up and down, but that hopefully those ups and downs will get, you know, sort of farther apart, and that it'll flatten a bit, and those kids will achieve a good, solid, you know, sort of baseline of healing, but that it takes a lot of time. And again, it's why we just want our parents to be very aware, so that they have patience with themselves and with their kids, that when they feel like, well, am I just not doing it right? Or why is this kid such a jerk? It's not that. I mean, kids can be jerks, but it's not that, right? It's their previous experiences, and they're really trying hard to work through a lot of challenges, and it just takes time. It takes repetition. And so we have to keep that all in mind. So I do want to talk just about post-adoption services. So luckily, we live in a state that has decided to devote resources to post-adoption services because they recognize how important it is to support our adoptive families, to make sure that everybody can remain successful. And so they're free to every family that has adopted and lives in Delaware. And that does include families who've achieved permanent guardianship of kids who were in foster care. So these services are free to all of those families, no matter, again, the sort of agency, state, or country they adopted from. If they live in Delaware, if they've adopted, or if they live in Delaware and they got permanent guardianship of a child who was in foster care in Delaware, they qualify for these services. And these services include support groups, which we hold on a monthly basis and do currently hold via Zoom, including a teen group, which we're doing twice a month right now to help our teens and parents. We have a diverse families group that happens on a quarterly basis. We have ongoing supports that include crisis management and case management. The case management is a broad term that really anything can fall under. So if they need some parent support in the home, if they need somebody to go to an IEP meeting with them, if they're trying to find a resource, we can help with all of those things. We have ongoing trainings and workshops for parents. And then we also have some respite options. So we have some families where we connect families together and we pay the family to provide some respite. And then we also have our Rec and Respite program, which is more specific to a smaller group of kids. It's children who've been adopted between the ages of 6 and 14. It is a group, or it's a program that we ask parents to commit to and participate in from September through June. It happens 2 Saturdays a month. It's a whole day, 9 to 4, and a group of about 15 kids, depending on the group that year. And the idea is that it's for our kids who have more challenges and who don't necessarily always do well in other recreation type activities or programs, and for parents who really need some respite because they have a hard time finding ways to take a break. And it is actually something we are also continuing via Zoom right now. It is interesting. We've had to mix it up, but it's a nice way to still connect with the kids. So we send them packets of activities, and then they come together via Zoom, and they are able to still sort of be all together and do activities together and play games. And it's been really nice to see them still have that opportunity. So that is all that I had to share. So I'm going to stop for questions we covered today. Again, feel free to use the chat box, or feel free to sort of raise your hand or unmute, and we can go through whatever would be helpful. I know I did such an amazing job. I answered all the questions, explained it very clearly.
I have a question.
Yes.
Going back to permanent guardianship and termination of parental rights. When permanent guardianship is granted, what remains? What does the parent who doesn't give up their rights still retain?
So they have parental rights, but they don't necessarily have the rights for like visitation or any of those kinds of things. They are just still the legal parents. Although again, the parents with the permanent guardianship have legal permanent guardianship. They can sign paperwork, they can do all of those things. And as I was saying, it's different than when it's sort of straight guardianship, where a parent can easily go and petition that guardianship be revoked. Not necessarily that it'd be easy for that to happen, but that is different with permanent guardianship. I do want to speak to the fact, again, not a legal authority. I'd be happy to have anyone else jump in and add information about this. But that, yeah. So they don't have custody, they don't have, again, they don't have rights necessarily like to visitation or any of those things. It's just that their parental rights have not been terminated.
So Meg, this is Lauren. I can add kind of an example of when that would happen. So when a family might take permanent guardianship, for example, would be that they still want to maintain contact and connection, legal connection with other family members. So such as grandma or aunt or uncle, because once parental rights are terminated, so are the legal connection to every other family member. Siblings would be another reason. So one benefit to doing permanent guardianship over adoption, and it totally depends on the family, would be to maintain those other relationships.
Okay.
Other questions?
I do have a question. When I guess I'm back to the parent guardianship and the parents not giving up their rights. So does that mean that they are able to interject themselves into the lives of the kids? Like they can tell the foster parents that they don't want to have certain things done, or is it just a legal thing? I don't know. I'm kind of still fuzzy about that.
Sure. So I'm happy to have other folks jump in. But no, not necessarily, right? The idea is that the parents with the legal guardianship, the permanent guardianship, I mean, that they are managing the day-to-day care. And if the birth parents wanted to, as you say, sort of interject themselves into the lives, they don't necessarily have the right to do that, which I know is very odd considering they still have their legal parental rights, but they don't have the right for those sort of day-to-day things. But again, I'm not a legal authority. Very clear. Not my area of expertise.
Yes, I understand, but thank you.
Okay. Other questions?
I have a question. I would say like on a non-COVID world, are your adoption classes pretty full? I know you do they're pretty ongoing. So how are they pretty full?
Yes. So the way that we do our classes is that it includes all of the types that we may have coming through. So we may have folks coming through for our foster care program, folks coming through for DFS foster to adopt. We have interstate cases in our traditional families. So they do fill up because we have all of those folks together in the same class, which is actually something that our parents usually appreciate because they like learning from the other people and the different circumstances. So our classes do generally get full. There are different times a year that they get a little bit fuller because I think you guys may know they're trying to get kids like finalized by the end of the year and those kinds of things. So our like summer and fall often get sort of filled up for that reason. But it just kind of varies. But yeah, and we try to limit this so there's no more than 25 people. We've had as many as 30, but we want it to be very interactive and we want them to get to know each other and we want to get to know them. And so we try to make it a smaller class. Yeah. Okay.
I have a question. How difficult is it to find families who want to adopt? Is that a challenge?
So I think what a challenge is finding families who want to care for or parent a child who is older. So we have a fair amount of families who come through wanting the younger kids, but for parents who are interested in our older kids, and by older I even mean like 8, 9 and up, right? Most folks either want the really little ones or like under 5. So it is harder to recruit for those families that are interested in the older kids. Yeah. So if you know anybody, so, yeah.
Awesome, Meg. Well, thank you so much for taking your time to do this training.
Oh, I see. Was
I
there
have
one
a
more?
question. Yeah. It pertains to blood relatives. So we have a case where it's a convoluted case, but we have parents where the birth mother has stepped out of the situation, and she has stated that she wants DFS to take hold of the baby. We have foster parents that have another sibling, and then we have a birth family member who is in the picture and feels very strongly that family should stay with family. However, her situation is kind of complicated. She has another child that she took from the same mother, and she has a grandchild. So, you know, you're looking at the balance of this. You've got the blood relative, you've got the birth mother. Birth mother also has stated she doesn't want this blood relative to be part of it. So it's a complicated thing, you know. We're trying to like get everybody together to stay connected, but you know, things come up like that are challenging to tactfully go through.
Yes, it is very complicated when family members are involved, and every situation will be a bit different. And I think there are just a few things we want to keep in mind, sort of broadly speaking, right? That kids do, all things being equal, generally do better when they can be raised with family members, with birth family members. That's just what, generally speaking, research tells us, that they do better when they can be raised with birth family. Obviously, not every situation is ideal, and so sometimes that's not the best option. And it also does get complicated when there have been other caregivers, like a foster family, that has been providing care and maybe would do well in the long term as well. And so I think keeping in mind that it is the ongoing connections, legal or not, that will matter. So I think what you're absolutely right is if there's a way to bring everybody together, that makes a big difference. One of the things we talk about is the difference between contact and openness, and that we need to make sure that there's a lot of openness, regardless of contact. But if we can have contact, then we also have to have openness. Like, there have to be relationships developed between everybody involved. So if the foster family is the one that's ultimately selected, because I have seen this happen where both a relative and a foster family will be presented to PPC, and then PPC makes that selection. Mm-hmm. That if we can develop some relationships so that all parties can remain connected, which I know, listen, I know it's possible, then that's ideal. So that's not really an answer for you, but that's just, again, broadly what we try and keep in mind.
Well, it kind of confirmed, I mean, that's the way we're going. We're trying our hardest.
Yeah,
together,
because there are a lot of feelings involved, and so it's sometimes right. That's why we have permanency planning committee. It's why we've got these different checks and balances, is so that there are multiple people sort of looking at a situation, mm-hmm. deciding this is what makes the most sense.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question. What do you tell parents, adoptive parents, about maintaining relationships with birth parents for the child?
So similar to what I was just saying in terms of like openness and contact, that if there can be appropriate ongoing contact, that it is something that we would recommend. We do think it is helpful for, again, every situation is different, but after an adoption finalizes, we think it's good to sort of take a break from, let's say, visitation or contact or those kinds of things, because a family needs to settle into sort of what they are now. But that if it can be appropriate, it can be helpful for kids to have that ongoing contact. But you're going to have to decide what that will look like and what the parameters will be, and assess as you go along. For some families, it's not an option because it won't be appropriate. But it is good to try if you can. Yeah. We also remind families that, again, that can be part of our post-adopt support, is that we can be there to help navigate those relationships. So if it's either something they're planning to do and they want to sort of help plan it, like, let's do it. Or let's say birth mom pops back up in a year and reaches out and they're like, oh, what do we do now? She seems like she's doing okay, but we don't know, right? Like we can help provide some support there, because it's not easy to make those assessments. And maybe you need a go-between, right? That's another piece. So sometimes there are reasons why birth family or adoptive families aren't as comfortable having direct contact with birth family members. And so maybe we start out as go-betweens and hopefully working to coming together, you know, with some openness and direct contact, but it's always going to look a little different. I never have a simple answer. Sorry. All right, other questions?
Cool, awesome, Meg. Well, thank you so much for taking your time to teach us this. I definitely appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. I'm glad that I could hopefully shed a little bit of light on the process. It's complicated, so thanks everybody.